the whisper that never asked to be heard. The room was quieter than Keanu Reeves was used to. Not the kind of quiet that followed applause or the hush before a director called action, but the deeper stillness that existed only in places where life slowed down on its own terms. A hospital room at dusk had that kind of silence, one that did not rush him, did not expect anything, did not demand strength or charm or answers. It simply existed, and for the first time in a long while, Keanu allowed himself to exist inside it too. The late afternoon light slipped through the narrow window, turning dust into floating constellations. His arm rested in a cast, but the weight he felt had little to do with bone or muscle. It was the familiar, invisible heaviness he had carried for years, the accumulation of grief, responsibility, gratitude, and the quiet pressure of being seen by millions yet truly known by very few. Fame had a way of amplifying loneliness if one was not careful, and tonight he was not careful at all. He stared at the city beyond the glass, at cars moving with purpose, at people unaware of the stillness he sat in. He had just returned from another charity visit earlier that week, another hospital, another anonymous donation delivered without cameras. He never spoke about those things. He never wanted to. Kindness in his mind lost something when it became performance. The door opened softly. At first he assumed it was a nurse. The sound was familiar, practiced, efficient, but then the rhythm changed, slower, gentler, intentional. He turned his head, and the world shifted just slightly. Sandra Bullock stood in the doorway, not dressed for an event, not dressed for an interview, but dressed the way people dress when they come as themselves. A simple sweater, hair loosely pulled back, her expression calm but attentive, as though she were stepping into a space she respected. She held 2 paper cups of coffee, and a small paper bag folded carefully at the top. "You always hated hospital coffee," she said quietly, as if raising her voice might disturb the moment itself. Keanu blinked, surprised in a way that felt strangely emotional. "You remember that?" She smiled, a small one not meant to impress anyone. "Some things stay." She stepped inside, closing the door with care, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Years of shared history stood between them, not heavy, not awkward, just present. Film sets, long conversations, laughter that came easily and silences that never needed explaining. She placed one of the cups on the small table beside his bed and sat down slowly, as if she didn't want to startle the room. "How are you really?" she asked. Keanu considered the question. He could have given her the answer everyone else got, the polite one, the manageable one. But something about her presence made that feel unnecessary. "I'm tired," he said finally, "not just from this." She nodded as if she had expected nothing else. They sat like that for a while, the quiet stretching but never thinning. Outside, the sun dipped lower, turning the room gold. Sandra reached into the bag and pulled out a cookie, placing it on a napkin beside him. "I made them," she said. "They're not perfect." "They don't have to be," he replied, and for a moment his voice wavered. She noticed, she always noticed. "You don't let people see when things hurt," she said gently, not as an accusation, but as an observation. "You never have." Keanu looked down at his cast, tracing the edge with his fingers. Some pain feels easier to carry alone. She leaned back slightly, studying him with the kind of look that came only from long familiarity. "That doesn't mean you're supposed to." The words settled into him quietly. Sandra turned toward the window, watching the city lights begin to flicker on. "Do you know why I came?" she asked. "I assumed concern," he said lightly. She smiled faintly. "That too." Then she turned back to him, her expression serious but warm. "I came to say something I never said properly." Keanu waited. She leaned closer, lowering her voice as if the room itself deserved discretion. "Thank you." The word was soft, almost fragile. For a second it didn't register. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't framed as a speech or a revelation. It was simply gratitude offered without expectation. "For what?" he asked, though part of him already knew. "For being kind when no one was watching," she said. "For showing up when it wasn't easy, for listening when I didn't know how to talk, for reminding me that goodness doesn't need to be loud." Her voice trembled slightly on the last word. Keanu felt something shift behind his ribs, something warm and aching. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, his eyes filled quietly without permission. Sandra noticed, and instead of drawing attention to it, she reached out and rested her hand gently over his. She squeezed once, just enough to say she understood. He didn't answer her thank you with words. He answered with stillness, with presence, with the kind of silence that carried meaning. And in that moment, something unspoken passed between them, something that would not end in that room. Outside, the city continued its noise, unaware that two people were rediscovering something simple and powerful. That gratitude, spoken sincerely, could heal more than medicine. That kindness, acknowledged, could change the weight of a heart. Sandra stood after a while, careful not to rush. "Rest," she said softly. "Heal slowly." He nodded, watching her walk toward the door. Before she left, she turned back once more, her eyes steady. "You matter," she said, "not because of what you do, but because of who you are." The door closed behind her. Keanu remained there, the room quiet again, but no longer empty. For the first time in a long while, he felt seen. And somewhere deep inside him, a silent reply echoed back to her, whispered, "Thank you," one that did not need sound to be understood. When silence learns to breathe. Morning arrived without ceremony, the kind that did not announce itself loudly, but simply slipped into the room as if it had always belonged there. Pale sunlight moved slowly across the hospital wall, climbing inch by inch until it rested on the edge of the bed where Keanu Reeves lay awake, his eyes open long before the world outside fully stirred. He had barely slept, not because of pain, but because his thoughts refused to be quiet. Sandra's whisper from the night before lingered in his mind, repeating itself without sound, weaving through memories he had not visited in years. "Thank you." Two simple words, yet they carried the weight of decades, of choices made quietly, of kindness given without witness, of moments when he had chosen empathy over recognition and silence over explanation. He turned his head slightly, noticing the small paper cup still resting on the bedside table. The coffee had gone cold, but he did not move to drink it. Instead, he stared at the faint drawing Sandra had made on it, a small, uneven, smiley face that looked almost childish, almost out of place in a sterile hospital room. Somehow, it made the space feel warmer. He reached out carefully with his uninjured hand and turned the cup slowly, as if it were something fragile. Fame had given him many things over the years, but it had never given him moments like this, moments that asked for nothing and yet gave everything. As the city outside began to wake, Keanu's thoughts drifted backward, pulled by the gravity of shared history. He remembered the first time he met Sandra Bullock, long before either of them had learned how heavy success could feel. Back then, laughter had come easily, and exhaustion had been the only real cost of long days on set. They had spoken about ordinary dreams, about books and music, and the strange, fragile beauty of human connection. Somewhere along the way, the world had grown louder around them, expectations sharper, losses deeper. Yet through all of it, their bond had remained untouched by performance, rooted instead in understanding. A nurse entered quietly, checking his vitals with practiced ease. She smiled politely, unaware that she was stepping into the aftermath of something deeply personal. "You had a visitor late last night," she said casually, adjusting a monitor. "She seems like a good friend." Keanu nodded, unable to trust his voice in that moment. When the nurse left, the room settled again, but this time the silence felt different. It no longer pressed down on him, it breathed with him. Later that morning, the door opened once more, softer than before. Keanu did not need to look to know who it was. He felt her presence the way one feels sunlight even with eyes closed. Sandra stepped inside carrying a small stack of books and another cup of coffee, her movements unhurried, respectful of the quiet she knew he valued. She placed the books carefully on the table, aligning their edges as if order itself were comforting. "I brought reading material," she said gently. "Nothing heavy, stories that don't demand anything from you." He smiled, a real one this time, the kind that reached his eyes. "You always know what people need," he replied. She shrugged lightly, sitting down in the same chair as before. "I just pay attention." They sat together again, not rushing to fill the space between them. Outside, traffic hummed faintly, life continuing at its relentless pace. Inside, time moved differently. Sandra picked up one of the books, flipping through it absent-mindedly before setting it down again. "You didn't say anything last night," she said, her tone calm, not probing. "And that was okay." Keanu exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the window. "Sometimes words feel too small," he admitted, "and sometimes they feel too loud." She nodded. Silence can be its own kind of honesty. That sentence settled into him with quiet clarity. He realized then how rarely people allowed silence to exist without trying to explain it away or fill it with noise. With Sandra, silence was not avoidance. It was trust. After a moment, he spoke again, his voice low but steady. Do you ever feel like the world only sees the parts of you that are easy to explain? Sandra leaned back, considering the question. All the time, she said honestly. People see success and assume strength. They don't see the nights you doubt yourself or the moments you wish someone would simply ask how you are without expecting a performance. He turned to look at her then, truly look at her, and saw something familiar in her eyes. The same quiet weariness, the same resilience forged not by applause but by endurance. You've always been there, he said softly, even when I didn't realize I needed anyone. She smiled, but there was a shadow behind it. So have you. The words carried more meaning than either of them said out loud. They spoke of late-night phone calls, of grief shared without spectacle, of encouragement offered without conditions, of kindness that never asked to be remembered. As afternoon approached, sunlight filled the room again, warmer now, more confident. Sandra stood, smoothing the sleeves of her sweater. I should let you rest, she said, but I'll be back. I know, Keanu replied, and the certainty in his voice surprised even him. She paused at the door, turning back just long enough to meet his eyes. You don't have to carry everything alone, she said once more, not as advice, but as reassurance. When she left, Keanu lay back against the pillows, the room quiet yet alive with thought. He realized something then, something subtle but powerful. Gratitude, when spoken sincerely, did more than acknowledge the past. It invited the future to change. He closed his eyes, letting that truth settle into his chest. Somewhere beyond the hospital walls, life continued its restless motion. Inside him, however, something had slowed, softened, begun to heal in a way no cast or prescription ever could. This was not the end of a moment. It was the beginning of something deeper, something built not on grand gestures or declarations, but on shared silence, mutual respect, and the quiet courage to say thank you when it mattered most. And as the light faded once more into evening, Keanu understood that the whisper he had received was not meant to end in a hospital room. It was meant to ripple outward, slowly, patiently, touching lives in ways neither of them could yet imagine. The weight people never see. The days that followed did not blur together the way hospital days usually did. Instead, each one seemed to carry its own quiet identity, shaped by small moments that refused to be insignificant. Morning light arrived gently, afternoons stretched with thoughtful stillness, and evenings settled in with a softness that made reflection unavoidable. For Keanu Reeves, recovery became less about his arm and more about the parts of himself he had neglected for years, the emotional fractures that had never shown up on X-rays because no one thought to look for them. Sandra's presence became a constant without ever becoming an obligation. She did not arrive with urgency or expectation. Some days she brought coffee and sat by the window reading quietly. Other days she brought nothing at all and simply existed in the room as if that alone were enough. There was comfort in her predictability, but even more in her restraint. She never asked him to open up, never pushed him toward vulnerability. Instead, she created a space where honesty could arrive naturally, without fear of judgment or misunderstanding. In a world that had always demanded answers from him, that kind of patience felt almost revolutionary. One afternoon, as the sky outside dimmed under approaching rain, Sandra sat across from him with her legs tucked beneath the chair, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she had barely touched. She seemed quieter than usual, her gaze distant, her smile slower to appear. Keanu noticed immediately. He always had, even back when neither of them knew how much those instincts would matter. "You're somewhere else today," he said gently, his voice low, careful not to break whatever fragile calm surrounded her. She looked up, startled for just a moment, then sighed softly. "I didn't mean to bring it in here," she said. "This place already carries enough." "Sometimes sharing lightens the weight," he replied, not as advice, but as an invitation. Sandra hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of the cup as though grounding herself in the simple motion. "Do you ever feel like you're expected to be grateful all the time?" she asked quietly, as if acknowledging struggle somehow cancels out success. Keanu leaned back slightly, understanding the question more deeply than he could ever say aloud. "All the time," he answered. "People confuse gratitude with silence. They think being thankful means never admitting when something hurts." She nodded, a subtle movement, but one filled with relief. "Exactly," she said. There are days when I feel strong, and days when I feel like I'm barely holding myself together, and somehow the world expects those two things not to coexist. The rain began tapping against the window, soft at first, then steadier, like a rhythm meant to accompany confession. Sandra continued, her voice steady but edged with emotion. I've spent so much of my life being the reliable one, the optimistic one, the one who shows up smiling. And most days, that's real. But there are moments when I wonder if anyone would still see me if I stopped holding it all so carefully. Keanu listened without interrupting, his attention unwavering. He recognized that feeling intimately, the quiet exhaustion that came from always being perceived as resilient. When she finished, he spoke slowly, choosing his words with care. People don't realize how heavy it is to be seen as unbreakable, he said. They think strength means immunity. It doesn't. It just means you've learned how to keep going. Sandra's eyes softened, her shoulders relaxing slightly, as though the simple act of being understood had eased something deep within her. She smiled faintly. You always know how to say things without making them sound like speeches. He returned the smile. That's because I don't mean them as answers, just reflections. They fell quiet again, but this silence felt different from the ones before. It was no longer just comfortable. It was connective. Outside, the rain intensified, streaking the glass and blurring the city into indistinct shapes. Inside, clarity grew sharper. Sandra glanced at him after a while, her expression thoughtful. Do you ever regret not letting people know more about what you do? She asked. All the things you give, all the lives you touch quietly. Keanu shook his head. No, he said simply. The moment it becomes about recognition, it stops being about kindness. I don't want my generosity to feel like a transaction. She studied him for a long moment, as if seeing something she had always sensed but never fully articulated. That's why your thank you mattered to me, she said softly, because you never ask for one. The words landed gently but powerfully. Keanu felt a familiar warmth rise in his chest, the same one he had felt the night she first whispered her gratitude. He realized then that her thank you had not been a conclusion. It had been a mirror, reflecting back a part of him he had learned to hide even from himself. As the rain slowed and eventually faded, leaving the world outside washed and quiet, Sandra stood and walked toward the window. You know, she said thoughtfully, maybe the world doesn't need louder heroes. Maybe it needs quieter ones who remind people that goodness doesn't require an audience. Keanu joined her gaze, watching the last droplets slide down the glass. Maybe that's how real change happens, he replied. Slowly, gently, without trying to be seen. She turned toward him then, her eyes filled with something deeper than admiration. There was trust there, and gratitude, and something unspoken that neither of them rushed to name. When visiting hours ended and Sandra prepared to leave, she paused beside his bed, resting her hand briefly on the rail. Thank you for listening, she said, her voice sincere. He met her eyes, his response once again silent but unmistakable. In that look was reassurance, respect, and the promise that she would never have to carry her unseen weight alone. After she left, Keanu lay back and listened to the quiet hum of the hospital once more. But this time, the silence did not feel empty. It felt like space being made for something new, something honest, something rooted in shared understanding rather than expectation. He understood now that healing was not always about fixing what was broken. Sometimes it was about finally acknowledging what had been held together for too long without rest. And somewhere deep within that realization, the whisper of gratitude continued to echo, growing stronger with every passing day, shaping a future neither of them yet fully understood, but both were beginning to trust. What the quiet begins to build. When the doctors finally cleared Keanu Reeves to leave the hospital, the moment arrived without celebration, just a brief nod from a physician and a stack of papers that spoke in clinical language about rest, patience, and limits. Yet for Keanu, walking out of that building felt like crossing an invisible threshold. The city air was warmer than he remembered, thicker with movement and sound, and as he stepped outside, he realized how insulated that quiet room had been from the world's noise. The hospital had not only held his body while it healed, it had slowed his spirit enough for him to finally hear what had been whispering inside him for years. Standing near the curb, waiting, he noticed how different everything felt now. Not brighter, not simpler, but more honest, as though something essential had been gently realigned. Sandra Bullock was there before he even looked up, leaning against her car with 2 cups of coffee balanced carefully in her hands, her posture relaxed but alert. the way it always was when she was quietly making sure someone else was okay. She smiled when she saw him, not wide or performative, but genuine, the kind of smile that didn't ask for anything in return. The drive back to his place passed in calm conversation, neither of them rushing to fill the silence, letting the city move around them instead of through them. Keanu watched pedestrians hurry past intersections, their faces tilted toward screens, their minds elsewhere, and he wondered how many quiet battles moved through those streets unseen, how many people carried kindness without anyone ever noticing. At his home, sunlight poured through wide windows, resting softly on furniture that carried years of memory. Sandra moved naturally through the space, setting his things down, opening windows, letting air circulate as if she instinctively understood that healing needed room to breathe. Her eyes lingered on a small framed photograph near the bookshelf, one that most visitors never asked about. It showed a modest school building, its walls simple, the smiles of children impossibly bright against the muted background. She picked it up gently, her fingers tracing the edge of the frame as if she sensed there was a story there that did not belong to headlines. Keanu watched her quietly, then spoke, his voice low and steady, explaining without embellishment how he had helped rebuild that school years ago after disaster struck, how he had kept his involvement anonymous, how one promise to a child had quietly grown into years of support. Sandra listened without interruption, her expression softening not with surprise, but with recognition, as though this simply confirmed what she had always known about him. They sat together later that afternoon, tea cooling in their hands as the sun began its slow descent, and the conversation turned not toward the past, but toward what came next. Sandra spoke about projects she cared about deeply, education initiatives that struggled not because of lack of heart, but because the world often moved on too quickly. Keanu listened, nodding, asking questions not as a celebrity offering help, but as a man genuinely invested in whether something mattered. Somewhere between her words and his silence, an idea began to form, not announced, not declared, but felt. The kind of idea that didn't arrive with excitement but with inevitability. They did not call it a plan. They did not give it a name. They simply acknowledged that something meaningful could exist if built patiently, quietly together. As evening settled, the house filled with the soft sounds of life continuing at its own pace, distant traffic, a breeze brushing through open windows, the subtle clink of cups being set down. Sandra stood near the door when it was time to leave, hesitating for just a moment before turning back to him. Her voice was gentle but sure. She told him that what he had given people over the years went far beyond money or opportunity, that it was the rare gift of being seen without being judged. Keanu met her gaze, his response once again unspoken but complete, a look that carried gratitude, respect, and something deeper than either of them felt ready to define. When she finally left, the door closing softly behind her, the house did not feel empty. It felt prepared, as though it knew something important was about to begin. That night, Keanu sat alone for a long time, not in loneliness, but in reflection, aware that the whisper he had received in a hospital room had not simply comforted him, it had shifted the direction of his days. He understood now that some connections did not arrive to change your life loudly. They arrived to remind you who you had always been. And as the city lights flickered beyond the glass, he felt a calm certainty settle within him. Whatever came next would not be rushed, would not be announced, and would not need permission from the world. It would grow the way kindness always did, quietly, steadily, and with purpose. The promise that learned to walk. The days that followed unfolded with a quiet consistency that felt almost deliberate, as if time itself had decided to slow down out of respect for what was taking shape. Keanu Reeves returned to a rhythm that looked ordinary from the outside, but felt profoundly different on the inside. Physical recovery continued at its measured pace, yet something deeper had already begun to mend. He noticed it in the way he woke each morning with less resistance, in how the silence of his home no longer pressed against him but seemed to hold him gently, like a pause rather than an absence. The whisper Sandra had left behind had not faded. It had settled, becoming a steady undercurrent that guided his thoughts toward intention rather than obligation. Sandra Bullock returned often, sometimes with purpose and sometimes with nothing but presence. There were afternoons spent at the dining table, papers spread out between them not as a formal strategy session, but as a shared curiosity about what could be done quietly and well. They spoke about education, about access, about the unseen barriers that prevented kindness from traveling as far as it could. Keanu listened the way he always had, with a patience that did not interrupt or rush, while Sandra spoke with a careful honesty shaped by years of watching good intentions falter without the right support. What surprised them both was how naturally their perspectives aligned, not because they were trying to agree, but because they valued the same things without needing to announce them. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the room in amber light, Sandra paused mid-sentence, her gaze drifting toward the window. She spoke then about disappointment, about the exhaustion that came from believing deeply in something only to watch it stall due to indifference or bureaucracy. Her voice did not carry bitterness, only a quiet sadness that acknowledged reality without surrendering to it. Keanu responded not with reassurance but with reflection, sharing moments from his own past when promises had been broken and expectations quietly adjusted. He spoke of learning to act anyway, to give anyway, even when outcomes were uncertain. In that exchange, they recognized something powerful, that hope did not require certainty, only commitment. As weeks passed, what had begun as conversation turned into action, still without fanfare. Emails were written late at night, calls made discreetly, connections reawakened not for publicity but for possibility. They were careful, almost protective of the work they were doing, ensuring it remained grounded in respect rather than spectacle. There were setbacks, moments when resources fell short or timelines stretched longer than expected, yet neither of them seemed discouraged. Instead, those obstacles became reminders of why patience mattered. They understood that anything built quietly needed time to learn how to stand. In quieter moments, when work gave way to reflection, they talked about the cost of being misunderstood. Sandra admitted that she had grown tired of being defined by strength alone, of having vulnerability treated as a flaw rather than a truth. Keanu shared how often silence had been mistaken for distance, how his reserved nature led people to assume detachment when, in reality, it was where his empathy lived. These confessions were not dramatic. They were offered calmly, with trust, and received without judgment. It was in those exchanges that their bond deepened, not because they were revealing secrets, but because they were finally allowing themselves to be fully seen by someone who did not need explanations. One night, after a particularly long day of planning, they sat on the porch as the city settled into its nocturnal rhythm. The air was cool, the sky clear, stars faint but present above the glow of distant lights. Sandra broke the silence by acknowledging something they had both felt but not yet named, that the work they were doing together had given them a sense of alignment neither had realized was missing. Keanu nodded, his expression thoughtful, and said that perhaps purpose felt lighter when it was shared, not divided or delegated, but held between people who trusted each other's intentions. The idea lingered between them, unspoken but understood. As Sandra prepared to leave that night, she stopped at the edge of the porch, turning back with a look that carried both gratitude and resolve. She told him that whatever came of their efforts, she was thankful for the way they had approached it, without pressure, without ego, without noise. Keanu met her gaze, offering the same silent response he had given her from the beginning, a quiet assurance that words were unnecessary when meaning was already clear. When she drove away, the night did not close in around him. Instead, it felt expansive, filled with possibility that did not demand immediate results. Inside, Keanu stood for a long moment, listening to the hum of the world beyond his walls, aware that something had shifted not only in his life, but in how he chose to move through it. The whisper that had begun in a hospital room had grown into a promise, not spoken aloud, but lived deliberately. It was a promise to continue choosing kindness without needing validation, to build without seeking applause, and to trust that the quietest commitments often carried the greatest weight. And as he turned off the lights and allowed the night to settle, he understood that this was not the end of a chapter, but the steady approach of something enduring, shaped by patience, guided by empathy, and strengthened by the courage to keep going without needing the world to notice. The quiet that reached the world. What finally changed everything did not arrive with urgency or announcement. It arrived the way most truths did in their lives now, slowly, almost unnoticed at first. Weeks turned into months, and the work that Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock had begun together continued to grow, not outwardly, but inwardly, strengthening its foundation before ever seeking visibility. Schools that once struggled quietly found new resources. Teachers who had nearly given up received support without being asked to perform gratitude. Children who had learned to lower their expectations discovered that someone had believed in them without needing to be known. None of this carried names or faces attached to it, and that was intentional. Kindness, they believed, traveled farther when it was light. Yet the world has a way of sensing movement even when it cannot immediately explain it. Conversations began circulating, not in headlines but in communities, among volunteers, among educators who noticed unusual coordination, unusual consistency, unusual respect. Someone eventually asked why this effort felt different, why it did not come with demands or conditions, why it seemed to listen before it acted. The answer, though rarely spoken aloud, traced back to a hospital room, to a whisper that had reminded two people of something the world often forgot: that gratitude could be a beginning, not an ending. One evening, after a long day of calls and quiet confirmations, Sandra sat across from Keanu at his dining table, her hands resting still for once, her expression thoughtful. She admitted that part of her had once feared the moment their work might become visible, that attention could distort intention. Keanu listened, then responded with the same calm clarity that had guided him for years, explaining that visibility itself was not the danger, but ego was. If the story ever needed to be told, he said, it would not be about them. It would be about the reminder behind it, that one sincere act could ripple outward in ways no one could control or predict. Sandra smiled then, recognizing the truth in his words, and for the first time did not resist the idea that sharing the origin of their work might help others begin something of their own. The opportunity arrived not as a press event, but as an invitation to speak at a small global gathering focused on compassion and education, a room filled not with cameras but with people who carried the same quiet determination. They stood there together, not elevated, not introduced with accolades, but simply present. Sandra spoke first, her voice steady, recounting how gratitude had once stopped her in her tracks, how saying thank you without expectation had changed the direction of her days. Keanu followed, not with a speech, but with reflection, explaining that silence had always been his language, but that silence became meaningful only when it held intention. He spoke of choosing kindness without needing witnesses, of believing that the smallest acknowledgments could become the strongest foundations. There was no applause when they finished, only stillness, the kind that meant people were listening deeply. Then slowly, hands came together, not loudly, not dramatically, but rhythmically, like rain beginning again. In that moment, Sandra glanced toward Keanu, her eyes carrying the same warmth they had in the hospital room months earlier. She leaned closer and whispered, just as she had then, "Thank you." And just as before, he did not answer with words. His expression said everything, calm, grounded, quietly full. Later that night, as they walked outside beneath a sky softened by city light, they spoke not about success or impact, but about peace. Sandra admitted that for the first time in years, she felt aligned rather than stretched, purposeful rather than pressured. Keanu told her that he had learned something unexpected through all of this, that letting someone see his silence had been an act of courage he did not know he needed. They stood there for a long while, two people shaped by experience, connected not by performance or history, but by a shared understanding that kindness did not have to shout to be heard. Somewhere far away, a classroom filled with light turned on for the first time after sunset. Somewhere else, a teacher read a letter that arrived without a signature and cried quietly at her desk. Somewhere else, a child learned to write the words "thank you" and did not yet know how powerful they could be. None of them knew the names behind what had reached them, and that was exactly the point. For Keanu, the whisper that had once melted his defenses had become a compass. For Sandra, gratitude had transformed from a response into a way of moving through the world. And for everyone touched by what they built, the lesson remained simple and enduring, that the most meaningful changes often begin without noise, without credit, and without certainty. They begin when one person chooses to acknowledge another sincerely, and when that acknowledgement is met not with words, but with understanding. As the night deepened and the city continued its restless motion, Keanu and Sandra stood in quiet companionship, aware that they had not changed the world, but had reminded it of something it already knew. That kindness, once recognized, had a way of multiplying, and that sometimes the most powerful reply to gratitude was silence filled with intention, a silent answer that could melt millions without ever needing to be heard.